What's up?
In today's video, I'll be showing you how to paint khaki.
Khaki.
Good day, friends, and welcome back to another Small Soldier video. I trust you're all well and hitting that modeling bench hard. As you're well aware, this video is all about painting khaki, so let's get into it. I wasn't really happy with the tone of the uniform at this point, so I decided to add a filter. If you're not sure what that is and you're new to modeling, basically a filter is something you use to alter or change the base color of whatever it is that you've painted, as opposed to a wash, which is there to accentuate details. Once the filter is completely dry, you may find you have some tide marks. That's easy to clean up with a brush slightly moistened in thinners, and you'll just go in and blend those into the surrounding areas. If you're an armor modeler, you're well aware of this technique, but it can also be used in figure modeling as well.
That's what I'm talking about.
Next, I use a thinner moistened Q-tip, and I remove some of the filter off the areas where I want the highlights to be. In most cases, I'll go back a second time with another clean Q-tip and remove a little more just to get a little more contrast happening. And as you can see, we have a nice starting point for the next steps. For those of you that were confused on what a wash and a filter is, this would be a wash. It's a concentrated mix of paint that you use to accentuate details and make things pop and come forward a little more. I haven't applied any kind of clear coat before this pin wash. It's just straight onto the model. Of course, you should let the previous steps dry overnight, or you may find you'll have paint moving around on the model. And nobody wants to see all that hard work go to waste. That's where working in oils is different than in acrylics. You do need to let things dry 24 hours before you get at them. That's probably the only disadvantage with oils compared to acrylics. But once you figure it out, you'll find working in oils is quite enjoyable. Once the details are dealt with, I'll go in and start sketching in where the shadows would be. This is a heavily diluted mix of cobalt blue, burnt umber, and just a touch of cadmium red. This is where the underpainting, or pre-shade if you will, helps guide you as to where to put those shadows. You'll notice I haven't done any blending with a soft brush at this point. I'm just trying to sketch in and determine where I want those shadows to be. The paint is also the consistency of a glaze at this point also, and I'm just building up multiple layers on top of each other and trying to create as much volume as possible before I start adding in highlights. Next, to create even more volume, I'll add the deepest shadows. This is a mix of the previous colors I used, but I'm adding a little more cobalt blue and burnt umber to the mix. I'm also being much more precise where I'm adding these shadows. They're less loose, they're more of a tight pattern, and I start blending in the areas to soften the transition. As you can see, I work very thin when I'm working in oils. I find this helps with dry time and helps keep the buildup of oils from getting too thick on the model. If you're looking to get a smooth finish on your figures, the best way I know of is to keep the paint thin. I found in the past when I did work with thicker oils, I couldn't get that smooth transition. Things would get really muddy and murky, and it was just really hard to keep things in control and keep things blended and smooth. Once all the shadows are established, it's time to go in with some highlights and give this figure a little more life. As you can see, I also like to work quite thin with my highlighting colors as well. I like to build these up in multiple layers, drying in between and then adding more, and then drying again and adding more on top of those. You can use a hairdryer to aid in this, or a light box if you have one. By keeping it thin, I find my time is much more productive and I get more done this way. Oh, I forgot to mention the highlight color here is a mix of yellow ochre and titanium white mixed into that previous khaki color from before. And I'll add more of those two colors as the highlights get lighter. At this stage, I figured the uniform needed to be a little more on the green side, so I thought by adding a straight yellow ochre filter, this would help achieve what I was looking for. To achieve even more dynamic highlighting, I used buff, but you can also use a mix of white and yellow ochre to get the same effect, just adding more white into the mix. I've said this before, and I'll say this in every figure painting video that I ever do, and that's to always push the contrast on your models. I know this style's not everybody's cup of tea. In my opinion, a figure without contrast really lacks the excitement and drama that ultimately we're all trying to capture on our models. Take a look at some of the best figure painters in the world and you'll see what I mean. As the highlights become more intense, my application becomes a little more precise where I'm adding the paint, and I'm not necessarily adding it throughout every highlight. I'm just sort of picking certain areas where I feel the most light would fall. Once I'm happy with all the highlights, I'll go back in with the very deepest shadows, and that's a mix of 50% cobalt blue and 50% burnt umber, and again working very thin. Always keep in mind where your light source is coming from, and that will help you determine where to put these deepest shadows and the highest highlights. And of course, remember to follow your pre-shade roadmap as well. Another way to determine where your highlights and shadows will fall is to take the primed figure and stick it in an environment where your light source is set up. You could use a table lamp or whatever and have it pointing at either below or from the side, and take a photograph of that, and you'll have that as a reference point while painting your figure. Although I don't use clear coats per se, I do use a clear coat in between some of these layers just to fix things in place so they don't move. I use Tamiya's rattle can matte coat, but I've heard people using testers, and I also use golden matte varnish as well, sprayed through my airbrush. I do certainly feel more comfortable using this method, as I really don't want all my hard work to be destroyed and wasted. Now that the uniform was complete, it was time to move on to the belt. To achieve a leather look, I'd seen other figure painters use a stippling method, and I thought this would be the best way to imply that effect. I achieved this by doing multiple stippled layers, building them slowly on top of each other, and then adding multiple glazes of lighter and darker shades in between. Using this technique can be hard on your brushes, so just be aware of that and maybe use your brushes that you're not that fond of. I'm using straight yellow ochre and titanium white for the highlights on the belt. It's certainly not the quickest technique in the world to use, but definitely helps achieve that random look that leather actually has. I was really trying to achieve a lot of depth at this point, and I wanted the layers below to kind of glow through the upper layers, and I was also trying to achieve that texture that leather has. Of course, you can't have highlights without shadows, so back I went with the shadow color, and I stippled that in and tried to create a nice transition between the two. With a clean brush, you can go back in and reveal some of that lighter tone below, further creating an even more stippled effect. With a slightly thicker paint, I went in and added the highest highlights to the belt. In tighter areas, I find a smaller blending brush really helps keep things clean and neat. And some more dark for a sweet, juicy transition. Now that the uniform was complete, it was time to add some shiny metal bits. This was my first experience using the AK Gen 3 paint, and I have to say I was thoroughly impressed. Out of any metallic paints I've used in the past, I'd say these were probably some of the best, as far as brushable metallic paints go. I used the old gold for the base color for all the buttons and hardware on the belt. As you can see, the paint goes on nice and smooth and leaves a nice metallic finish. When using metallics on a figure, always remember to be very careful that you don't get that metallic pigment on the uniform itself, because it can be really hard to remove and you can end up with a bit of a metallic sheen on the uniform, which, to be honest, can be a real to remove. To tone and shadow the buttons, I like to use burnt umber as the base. This works great to create the shadows and also tones down that gold to make it look a little more natural. This is a technique that Bill Horan employs on his figures, and I've been using it for years. This is a fantastic book, and if you don't have it in your library and you're a figure painter, you really need to get it. Sorry I couldn't show you how I painted the metal ribbon bar, but I had to work way too close and I just don't think the camera would have picked up what I was doing. Maybe in another video I might be able to do that sometime.
Hey, if you like this video, please subscribe and hit that bell notification below so you never miss an episode. That way the big boss at YouTube will promote my videos more and will be suggested to more people just like you. That's it for this one. Stay funky, bros. And most importantly, keep those brushes wet.